Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Resistance United Great Britain in partnership with Genesis. Today we have a special guest, Mr. Bhandari, who is the founder of the Incredible Capital and Morality, which is an annual conference held in Vancouver, Canada, which brings together some of the finest minds to discuss philosophy of freedom. Mr. Bhandari is a champion of freedom and advocate of reason. I'm very happy and honored to welcome you, Mr. Bhandari. Thank you very much.
Harry, thank you very much for having me here. I have just completed a 25-hour-long flight. I flew in from Bangkok. I was there for a day, and I have been on my way from India. I arrived in the US a couple of hours back, so I'm very glad to be here with you. I don't know how long I will last, given that it's been a long flight, but I try my best to do justice to this talk. I have spent something like 6 to 8 months in India over the last 1 year. I no longer live in India. I left India about 20 years back. But I'm deeply attached with the country. I want to understand what's happening in that country, not just because I grew up in that country, but also because 1 out of 5 people on the planet live in India. So it's extremely important to understand what's happening there, because whether you like it or not, what happens in India will affect you at some point of time. Now, I have been very interested in cultural issues for a very long time, probably all my life. I have tried to understand why certain societies do well and why certain societies stay wretched and poor forever. What I've seen is that, people like to break countries into the Christian Western societies, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, northern part of Africa, Latin America. So we can try breaking the world into many, many parts if we want to. But I came to a conclusion that pretty much you can break the world into 2 parts. One is the rational part of the world, a part of the world that likes to think and reason. And this is predominantly the people who are of European background, West Europe, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And there are a bunch of countries that have, in many ways, become very westernized, and probably more westernized than the Western society itself. And these people have very nicely copied the good aspects of the West. And these are East Asian societies of Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and increasingly China. Now, a lot of people would crib about China, but they are usually the people who haven't been to China. Just about everything that we use today is now produced and manufactured in China. China is a real country. Now, China is facing a crisis right now. I hope it overcomes that crisis. But apart from the Western society in East Asia, most of the rest of the world is what I call the rest. And these are particularly societies of South Asia, which is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, most of the Middle East, and all of Latin America. What you see among these, the countries in the rest, is that the concept of reason is conspicuous by its absence. And this is particularly true in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian subcontinent. Now, a lot of people think that these are emerging markets. Now, there's nothing emerging about, let's say, South Asia. India is constantly portrayed as the fastest growing economy today in 2022. It is portrayed as a country that will overtake China over the next few years. And anyone who has been to India and China both understands it very well that you should never ever try to compare the two countries. China is a country that is continuously improving. It has its problems, it has its political and cultural problems, and I don't want to deny that. The thing with China is that it is improving, and whenever a society is improving, I want to be supportive of it rather than oppose it and point out its negative aspects. But there are countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, the whole of Sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of Latin America that is getting worse by the day. Now, I left India 2 days back, and what was happening when I left was that the government was insisting on people to fly the Indian national flag for the Independence Day that's coming on the 15th of August, 2022. Now, you should be allowed to fly the flag. I fully understand it. But the government has almost made it compulsory for residential units to fly the Indian flag. But it is certainly compulsory for the businesses, because if the businesses don't install the flag, the labor inspectors or food inspectors or whatnot will come and shut down your business. But even residences will have to fly it. If you don't fly it, the government politicians are asking people to take photographs of those houses and report it to the tyrants who run that country. Now, I agree that people say India is the biggest democracy. It is the biggest democracy, but in my view, it is far worse of a police state than, let's say, China is. You are not in a position to speak much against the government, because if you speak anything against the government, you can be reasonably assured that your electricity and water supply will get affected. The police will file fake cases against you, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about police filing fake cases in that country. Now, China restricts your political speech, but any instruction to impose restrictions on you has to come from the very top. That is not the case in India. A local policeman who is usually brain dead, 100% venal. In fact, every single public servant in that country is corrupt, will have no capacity to understand the law. He will make the law as he goes along, and he will impose his views on you. They can and will charge you for crime that you never committed, on which they never did any investigation. And yes, you might get proven to be correct after 3, 4, 10 years, but you will have spent a fair amount of your time in the jail. The court will hold the policeman not accountable for what he will have done. So let's go back a bit and understand what's been happening in India. When Islamic rulers came to India, India was a feral society. Now, I know fully well that some fancy economist, a Marxist economist who decided to live in the United States, came up with a figure that India was, the British stole something like $45 trillion from India. And I've tried to work out how she came with that figure, and I will probably not explain how erroneous that figure is, but that is actually a number that she came up from no background at all. Now, India was indeed one of the richest countries on the planet 500 years back. But 500 years back, every country was poor and tropical countries had to be reasonably rich just because of the fact that the sun provides free product of vegetables, fruit, and agriculture to a tropical country. Indian GDP per capita in 500 years back was still about $400 per capita. The reason India's proportion in the world's GDP fell drastically was not because the British exploited India. It was because India could not progress or industrialize the way the Western world was able to. The Western world was able to imbibe the values of the industrial revolution very rapidly and grew at a very fast rate. India failed to grow at a very high rate. But having said that, if you look at the GDP growth rate of India or the GDP changes of India, India actually continued to grow during the time the English and the Islamic rulers ran that country. Now, what happened with the missionaries, Christian missionaries and English colonizers was that they clearly saw when they interacted with Indians was that there was no concept of moral values in that country. It was essentially a tribal country that was after resource acquisition. And it did not matter to the people in that country whether their approach to resource acquisition was moral or immoral. The reason Islamic rulers were able to come and occupy that country and thereafter Europeans were able to do the same was because Indian rulers at that time were extraordinarily exploitative, and they ran this society without any concept of reason. The end result was that the local people in that country were very happy accepting Islamic rulers and thereafter English rulers to rule them. Both these rules, particularly the European rule over India, was extraordinarily advantageous to that country. And it does not take much understanding to accept that Sub-Saharan Africa or Indian subcontinent or Americas would have gone nowhere had Europeans not occupied these countries. So would have been the case in New Zealand and Australia as well. If you look at how much progress these societies had seen before European came over the earlier few thousand years, you realize that there's absolutely no evidence that these people would have come out of their tribal way of life, living like cavemen, had Europeans not colonized these countries. Now, for several years, I've been very keen on understanding about why European missionaries thought that these were pagan people. And the reality is that if you had come to a country like India or Sub-Saharan Africa in the 15th century or 16th century, you would have realized that there was no way to communicate any concept of ideas with people of these societies because they had no rational framework to understand the world or communicate with the world. They were amoral people, which means that they had no concept of right and wrong, and they had no concept of reasoning. These people, even today, are essentially driven by the desire for food and sex and power over other people. This is the so-called social structure that these societies have. Now, the problem is that over the last 50 to 70 years particularly, a new concept called political correctness has come to exist in the Western society, which means that the wisdom that Europeans had gleaned out of ruling these third world countries has been lost in the West today. because people simply cannot say the fact that the third world is essentially an immoral, amoral, valueless society, virtually totally irrational in how it conducts itself. Now, because of this political correctness, that wisdom has been erased out, and also visitors who go to countries like India find it extremely hard to return back to the West and speak up their mind. If at all they can change their mind, they are extraordinarily afraid of speaking if they see something bad happening in that country, because they don't want to look racist. Now, my view is that people should speak up facts. Facts are not racist. It's when you are bigoted based on the race of people that you are racist. Now, imagine what happened in the 1940s. In the 1940s, after the Second World War, British were no longer in a position to want to rule countries like India. Over the next 10-15 years, they basically left most of their colonies. Now, what the British did was that they wanted to make local saints. They wanted to handshake with these people before they left, rather than leave those societies with a sour feeling. So when people talk about Indian Independence Day and how Indians fought for their independence, that's all fake. Most of the people who fought for so-called independence of India were a very, very small minority of people who ironically went to study in the UK, returned back to India, and they realized that the British weren't going to shoot them down. So they thought it was a good opportunity for them to get into positions of power by fighting against the British. Now, those were the times when widows were sent on the funeral pyre of their husbands, which meant that they were burnt alive after the death of their husbands. Child marriages were extraordinarily common. The kind of crimes that happened in that country, sacrifices of animals, sacrifices of human beings, these were not uncommon issues in that country. British tried very hard to bring that society into civilization, and they succeeded to quite an extent. Now, if I were an Indian at that point of time, and there were many Indians who saw what the British were doing and said that they wanted to be a part of the British Empire, help them out, and bring India out of its wretchedness and extraordinary cultural backwardness. In fact, there was no culture. It was an amoral, valueless society, and missionaries tried to impart some concept of values and morality to that country. And whatever I'm saying about India is largely true about Sub-Saharan, actually all true about Sub-Saharan Africa, and completely true also about Australia, New Zealand, and Americas. Now, what happened after India became independent in 1947 is that India became a democratic country. The top leaders that British had left in place continued to be in power for many, many years. Very slowly, Indian democracy continued to bring in new people from its own society. What you have seen across the third world, and if you forget about the romanticization that has happened because of the World Bank, the IMF, and many of the publications and the mainstream media, is that after these countries became independent, virtually all of them rapidly became tyrannies, dictatorships or tyrannies, and ruthless dictatorships. Now, a lot of people IMF and the World Bank would say that they were not democratic. That's why they became ruthless tyrannies. But that's not true. They became democracies and thereafter they became ruthless tyrannies. That is the causality. Democracies in the third world has essentially led these countries into becoming ruthless tyrannies. Now, if you look at the economic growth rates of these countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and in the Indian subcontinent, what you see is that the growth rates of these countries lagged behind growth rates in the Western society. So not just in absolute terms, they were lagging behind, but even in terms of percentage growth, they were lagging behind continuously for many, many decades. Now, here is the problem. Something changed in the 1980s. What changed in the 1980s was a new kind of technology that suddenly came into existence, and that new technology enabled communication to happening at lightning speed between the West and the rest. And what that meant was that a few million Indians, for example, were able to communicate with the West and become their back office workers. They could do some basic coding for them, software coding. They could become the call centers for the West. Now, 4 or 5 million Indians ended up becoming workers in the IT industries and call centers. Now, 4 to 5 million people is nothing in comparison to the size of the Indian population, but that small influence was enough to drastically contribute to percentage growth rate of the economy of India. Indian economy, GDP per capita was probably $800 per year. Today is about $2,000 per year. So really from the perspective of India, a lot has changed from 800 to 2000, but it continues to be an extremely rich country. Now, here is the problem. The World Bank and the IMF will romanticize that countries like India are growing at an exceedingly fast rate and a faster rate than what's happening in the Western society. But let's look at the numbers closely. What does, let's say, a 10% growth rate of India means? On $2,000 GDP per capita, a 10% would translate into $200 per year new GDP per capita. Only $200 per capita new GDP. But if the US grows by only 1%, its $60,000 per capita GDP would grow by $600, which means the US would, in absolute terms, would be growing 3 times faster than India would be. So by comparing elephants with ants and by looking at the growth rate, they want to show the World Bank very erroneously. It's mathematically a mistake that even primary school students shouldn't make. You cannot compare growth rates of ants with growth rates of elephants. But by doing this thing, the IMF and the World Bank and the international media has tried to show that these ants are now influential in the world space. They aren't. And then the fact remains that over the last 10 years, the third world countries have come to stagnate. And the reason they have come to stagnate is that most of the benefit that they experienced from late 80s until for the next 20 years was because of internet. It wasn't because culturally the third world has changed or because they had educated their population or they had become rational or creative people. The only change that happened was because of technology, a gift of technology that they got from the West. What they did over over those 20 years is that they plucked the low-hanging fruit, and now that the low-hanging fruit have been plucked, they have come to stagnate. Most of the third world over the last 10 to 15 years has been stagnating. In fact, if you look at Latin America, Chile is rapidly going leftist. Peru is going leftist. Ecuador is already very leftist. Mexico now has a leftist president. Virtually everything in Latin America is becoming leftist. India's GDP per capita has been about 2,000 US dollar per capita for the last 2 or 3 years. It is refusing to move up, except that the IMF and the World Bank will consistently project a very high growth rate of India, and then a year later, recognizing that India did not grow up what they expected it to be, they would then make up a rationalization why India did not grow up and why it would pick up a faster pace of growth going forward. Now, they don't like China in comparison to the other countries because China is not a democratic country. And I'm really happy that China is not a democratic country, because democracy is really the worst way to run any society. Democracy is by definition anti-meritocratic, which means that instead of the best people running a society, what you have is the masses deciding who should run the country. The masses anywhere in the world, even in relatively enlightened countries like Switzerland or Sweden or England, would still vote for bread and circuses. There's no way you can avoid a degradation of your institution under a democratic system. Now, the problem with the third world is that there is no enlightenment in these countries. The people are essentially tribal. They're apathetic. Even the educated people in these countries only worry about how to maximize their resources. They are not interested in the general welfare of their own people. As a result, the institutions that the British left behind in countries like India have rapidly been hollowed out. So despite the fact that between late 80s and 2005, let's say, the third world countries grew economically, culturally they had been degrading since the time the British left these countries. The institutions got hollowed out. And today, from what I have seen, at least in India, there's no institution left. There are no checks and balances left. Corruption is 100% in the society, which means that I have never in my life met an Indian public servant who is honest in doing his job. They are 100% corrupt, and nothing ever happens in that country unless you pay a bribe. Court system simply does not work because judges don't have no concept of the law. They have no concept of right and wrong, and they have no moral passion. They don't want to sit in front of the alleged criminal and the alleged victim to work out who should go to prison and who shouldn't. These judges are only interested in the bribes that they can collect. The end result is that these Western institutions that Europeans left behind in the third world have taken over what would have been the local institutions of those societies, which would have been tribal Taliban kind of institutions in those societies, into institutions that simply don't work. So there is no concept of law and order left in these third world countries. And I'm going to come to this conclusion eventually in my talk, if I don't forget about it, which is that a Taliban kind of institutional framework is the only institutional framework that is possible for the third world countries. There's no escape from it. And when you get a Taliban kind of institutional framework, you should be happy because at least some kind of justice will start getting served. Under the current Western institutional system in the third world, nothing gets done. And the reason is that the Western institutions do not function unless they are run by Western people. You have to be people who are moral. And my granddad used to tell me all the time, my dad is still keeps telling me about this, that it was the English rulers who were in India were essentially incorruptible. You could not bribe them or you could not manipulate them. They had a massive sense of right and wrong, and they were driven with a passion for moral values. And they wanted to implement the right and wrong structure on the society, a structure that was fair, which is what is called even today the English sense of fairness on that society. But with Indians running that society who are completely apathetic, there is no fairness in anything that happens in that society. A person can face an accident and you can be absolutely sure that no ambulance will come for hours and the police car will do nothing, and most people simply die on the road, and that's when the police wants to send that dead body to the hospital. So nothing happens in that country under the current institutional framework. Now, a lot of people say, is there a hope for improvement? Now, I have alluded to this very clearly, that over the last 75 years that India has been so-called independent, its institutional framework has continued to worsen. There is absolutely no way for the country to change its direction going forward. Now, the host wrote to me that I should talk about Modi, the current Prime Minister of India. Now, Modi is a Hindu fanatic. A lot of people in the Western world, particularly my libertarian friends, think that Modi is like a counterpart of Donald Trump in India. And that is completely erroneous understanding of what Modi is. Modi is a thug. Modi is a tyrant, and he's a very low IQ person who is also a Hindu fanatic. Now, remember that most fanatics are not there because they actually believe in their religion. They are there because it gets them into positions of power. And that is what Modi is trying to do. Modi has inflicted a massive amount of pain on Indian society over the last 8 years. And the situation is getting rapidly worse in that country. Now, this is happening despite that the IMF and the World Bank continues to sing praises of India. As I said, I spend a fair bit of my time in that country, and there's nothing that happens in India that I can see as an improvement happening in that country. That country will continue to get worse, and my guess is that India will fall apart into smaller countries, or at least it will fall into a complete chaos over the next few years. And the reason is not Modi. Modi is just a symptom of the problem. The real problem is Indians. Indians without English rule, without English and Europeans directly administering that country, will revert back to its pre-British setup, which will be a tribal setup, which means that the country is unsustainable as the way it exists, and that's perfectly fine. But remember that when in 1947, when India and Pakistan became two countries, about 1 million people died in the violence that happened. So anyone who tells you that people of India and Pakistan are relatively non-violent are completely wrong. People become violent when they get into mobs. The insecure masses, when they get into mobs, become extraordinarily violent because the facade of the mobs gives them a sense of security, and then they start doing crazy things. So India will fall apart over the next few years. All these institutions no longer work, but physically they will fall apart as well. What I call Indian system as chaosism, that will prevail, and that will become increasingly visible in India as time goes by. Now, yeah, is someone trying to say something?
Yeah, may I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
If I may interrupt, I would like for you to explain a little bit about the Hinduism as the source of all that. How does it play into this thing that you are describing before us? And also, what are the dangers in this kind of religion and spirituality which is affecting the West? Obviously, you can see how damaging it is to the West and to the values and the virtues of the modern Western men and women. So maybe you can speak about that a little bit.
Okay, so a lot is talked about Indian spirituality. I have never seen a spirituality in that country. Yes, indeed, you have had a few good philosophers and spiritual leaders coming out of that country. But I'm currently in San Francisco, and you see a lot of Indian yoga teachers and so-called gurus in the West Coast. West Coast is probably the place where most of the absorption of Eastern values happen. But really, most of these gurus are scam artists. They fool the Western people. But what is most attractive about India is actually the most harmful aspect of the Indian society. And that aspect is what I called feralism. Because Indian society has no moral values, it is a feral society. Now, when you and I go to a pub and have a few beers, we enjoy it, we have fun. But that fun does not mean that that is what life is supposed to be. Life requires you to be disciplined, requires you to exist under certain constraints and restraints. Now, in the 1960s, when hippies, what came to be known as hippies, started going to India, Beatles went to India, and then thereafter, several of the people like Madonna and Michael Jackson got involved. I'm not sure about Michael Jackson actually, but certainly Madonna got involved in India, and a lot of celebrities, who I would call the Hollywood celebrities, got involved in India. India became a romantic culture because India offered people this expectation of liberty and freedom. But really, India is a feral society, and to a lot of people, it might look freedom, but it's actually just a complete chaos. And we see it already reflecting in how it's affecting the Western society today. Western society has a new bunch of people who are called woke. And these woke people, the climate change activists, or a lot of environmentalists, a lot of people who are against all kind of development, are the kind of people who are feral. And that is why exactly they like people of the third world countries, because they have no concept of discipline. They don't understand where wealth comes from. And when you don't understand where wealth comes from, it has a tendency to disappear, get dissipated and frittered away. So wokeism is nothing but the feral aspect of the third world countries, and which is becoming a big part of the first world countries. And now your rulers, Justin Trudeau, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, are actually woke people who don't understand, who are feral people who have no attachment to Christianity or an understanding of Western values or Western philosophy. Harry, did I respond to your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I would also like to ask about the structure of the family in third world countries. Do you see it breaking down like it does in the West?
So this is a very common question, and I think the question is structured wrongly. Let me explain this. When I was growing up, I would say at least 10% of women in my city were walking around topless. The concept of clothing came to India, and of course in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Americas and in Australia, came from Islamic rulers and thereafter through the Christian colonizers. If you look historically at India, having multiple wives was not uncommon. Rich people were able to have multiple wives, and certainly they had no restrictions in having relationships with other women. Promiscuity was a norm in these countries. Promiscuity continues to be a norm in Sub-Saharan Africa and in many parts of Latin America. So the conservativeness that came to India was a product of Christian missionaries. So if I restructure the question, the fact is that the concept of family came to the third world from Europe. European family structure is falling apart because you have accepted third world values in your institutional buildup. You have enabled democratic movement and this romanticization of the so-called Indian spirituality to change your values into feral values, which is no values, and as a result, your families are breaking down. Now, the fact remains that I had never seen a happy family in India until I arrived in the UK. It took me a couple of weeks or a couple of months to start realizing that it was actually possible to have happy families. So while English missionaries and colonizers left a proper family structure framework in India, they could not implant the right foundations in that society, which meant that families in India were extraordinarily unhappy, and I had never seen a happy family in that country. So again, the families that are breaking apart in the West today is largely because they have decided to accept the feral values of the third world countries.
I understand. Thank you. What you describe about India is also applicable to countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, I don't know, even let's say South Africa, because South Africa has changed tremendously since '94 under the ANC. Can you speak about that a little bit, about those countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So remember, India and Sub-Saharan African countries are very special cases. They are far worse than, let's say, Thailand or Philippines or Indonesia are. what I like to do when I look at Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia is I want to look at what proportion of their societies is Chinese. Chinese are the community that is responsible for a lot of economic progress in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Philippines. Now, of course, the locals, the other non-Chinese locals might envy the Chinese, might not like it, but their growth rate has a direct correlation with how many Chinese there are in those societies. The same is the case with Vietnam. Now, as far as South Africa is concerned, I have been to South Africa many times, and it is as if in front of my eyes that first world country fell apart into a third world country. What happened in South Africa is exactly what's happening in the other third world countries, and you should look at South Africa as how, let's say, the United States will become another South Africa as time goes by. South Africa faced an institutional destruction because of the racial policies that they brought in. They because of the change in how the institution, the government was run, blacks had to become, by regulatory edict, majority players in the institutions, in businesses and in the government, even though they were completely unprepared for it. And unfortunately, I think exactly the same thing is happening in the Western society today with this ESG in companies and making diversity quotas for blacks, people of color, women, and LGBTQ plus in institutions. Did that respond to your question?
Yes, sir. One thing that is common in our groups is that we are very aware of the decline of the West and the dangers that are appearing. We feel unsafe. Do you recognize any other place other than the West in the world where we can have relative freedom and safety and the kind of cultural background that can support and promote life and freedom and, men rights?
Right. So one suicidal thing that the Western society, and probably the biggest mistake the Western society did, was to bring in a lot of people from outside the Western society. America was a perfect melting pot, and there's nothing wrong with how America invited good people to come to America, but it was all fine as a melting pot as long as they were getting people from West Europe to come to America and settle down. Here is a problem. The concept of liberty is a uniquely Western phenomenon. The problem with people of the third world is that they simply do not have anything in their cultural background to understand and comprehend the concept of liberty. This is what suicidal that they did. America rapidly brought in people from other parts of the world in their intention to become a diverse society, but non-Europeans simply do not have the concept of liberty, and over generations, they have failed to incorporate the concept of liberty in their societies. And I'm talking about communities who are of non-European background. The United States today is now close to between 40 to 50% ethnically non-European. So liberty will get diluted away particularly in the institutions, because institutions are elected based on democratic system, and a majority will is now becoming non-European. The only place where I have seen a possibility of chaos not to set roots is East Asia. If you and I want to become Japanese resident or citizen, it is virtually impossible. The same is the case with, let's say, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan. So those countries, and South Korea, they have retained, particularly Japan, South Korea, you cannot become their citizen. And I think staying homogeneous is a very good quality, particularly if you can avoid tribal people, inward-looking tribal people to come into your country. So yes, I think they have done a very good job, something suicidal that the West has done. So I think East Asia has a lot of hope, but my fear is that the concept, while East Asia has copied all the good aspects of the Western society, I don't think they have been able to replicate the foundations, which is the Western philosophy and Western religion, in their societies. So I don't know what will happen once the West has ceased to be a free place, because the spring of philosophy and the spring of Western values need that framework of Christianity and philosophy, and East Asia very likely does not have it yet. But that's a sad thing about the world, because once the West ceases to have Western values as an essential part of its social framework, there's really no society left after that.
I understand. Thank you. If you are not too tired, because you traveled for so long, you said 25 hours, that's a very long travel. If you still have a few minutes, I would like for you to give us a quick overview of what you see today in the world economics and the financial situation, the threat from Russia and Ukraine, the inflation, the supply lines. If you can just enlighten us a little bit.
Right. So let's talk about something else first. One is that I spent a lot of time watching protesters in Hong Kong. There had been a democratic movement happening in Hong Kong, supported by what I called American woke people, the Western woke people. Now, put yourself in the position of the CCP in China. Now, I'm no fan of CCP, but put yourself as the president of China and think about how you would deal with Hong Kong, even if you wanted to keep Hong Kong independent. With Hong Kong protesting for democracy and protesting against China, if China had continued to let Hong Kong do what it was doing, China itself would have become unstable, because parts of China would then have started asking for democracy or secession from the Union. Now, right in front of me, when I was in one of the protests, a protester climbed up the pole to remove the flag of China from outside the government building in Hong Kong. So that was going to affect China very badly, and that's what China did. And I think similarly, by talking too much about Taiwanese independence, woke people of the West are agitating China for no good reason. Now, I am all for independence of China. I think Taiwan deserves to be an independent country, but this should have been done when China was a weak country. Now you are simply agitating China and doing nothing else. China will never accept Taiwan to become officially independent, because if they did, Xinjiang, Tibet, and many other parts of China will start asking for the same. And that will destabilize China. Now, coming to Ukraine and Russia, I take no sides. I think the woke people of the Western society, and again, it's very important for a normal person in the Western society to remember that Western governments no longer represent Western values and Western philosophy and Western civilization. They are woke people. Trying to force democracy in the Middle East, for example, was not going to work. After removal of Saddam Hussein, Iraq became far worse than what it was. As I said earlier, having Taliban kind of governments is the right framework for most of those societies, but let the local people handle their own societies. Now, Western woke people have tried to influence how Russia and Ukraine should be run. They have tried to expand the borders of NATO, which made no sense because the agreement between NATO and Russia was such that Ukraine should have been left as a neutral country. So in many ways, it was the Western society Western woke governments that are behind creating this problem between Russia and Ukraine. Trump very likely would never have let this problem happen. Again, we have a conflict of vision here. Western woke people simply cannot understand that there are people who don't think the woke way. And the woke people think that they are the most enlightened people on the planet. And because they don't have any discipline or boundaries, they don't understand how wealth is created, and still they exist in a very wealthy environment. But that does not mean that left to themselves, they would have created a wealthy society. But I think that's where the problem of Ukraine and Russia, from within my limited understanding, comes from. And there's no end to that problem because woke people don't understand the concept of right and wrong and letting other people get on with their lives the way they want to live. Let me talk about inflation. I think there's a big difference between what happened in 2008 and today. In 2008, when we had a financial crisis, a lot of print money, most of the money that got printed went into the hands of elite, the rich people, who did not have to bring that cash into the market. What we have today is that in the Western society, a lot of that printed money went into the hands of poor people who got the money and who will use that money irrespective of the interest rate, because they still need to use that money for their personal consumption, the food and accommodation. But also that money removed a lot of poor people from the working sector. They don't want to work anymore because if you get free money, why should you work? So that is one big problem we created. The COVID also in many, many ways harmed globalization very badly. It is very, very hard to bring the system back into sync, different parts of the system to come back in sync with each other once you had created disturbance in that system, and that is creating a stagflation, which means that you have a higher cost of production and without salaries necessarily going up. So you will have inflation as a result of it. I think clearly the Western society has peaked, primarily because of its institutions. We have the bad aspects of democratic values in the Western society. Societies are reflecting in people like Justin Trudeau, Kamala Harris, and virtually every Western leader today. Look at Australia and New Zealand. So unfortunately, Western society has peaked and the third world is going to crash. There are about 10 to 15 countries that are facing massive economic problems right now. The mainstream media will not cover Ethiopia, Nigeria, India, Pakistan. They are only covering, I think, Sri Lanka right now, because Sri Lankan problem is so much at the surface. But there are a lot of third world countries that are facing huge crisis. and they will fall apart. And something like 5 billion people live in the third world.
So, how do we protect ourselves from this troubling future? Like how to protect our savings? What to do? Because if the West is going down and the rest of the world is going down, what is there to do?
Well, as I said, East Asia continues to be the best part of the world today, at least economically. And because they are homogeneous and because the people in those countries are focused on economic growth and social stability, they are actually very good places to keep your wealth in. Certainly, Japan is my favorite country. It's totally worth it for people to visit Japan or China because most people who don't understand China are people who have never been there. If you go on a Japanese train or public transportation, people don't talk with each other. Certainly no one plays his mobile cell phone loudly in front of other people because they don't want to disturb other people. And so that's the kind of respectful culture it still exists in Japan. Very good places, very safe places. You see 5 or 6 year old kids walking on the street by themselves in Japan. So is the case in Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea. Very safe places. And in fact, China is an extremely safe place for most people. A lot of Chinese women will tell you that they are not afraid of going out later in the evening by themselves in China. So I think people really should understand East Asia. There are a lot of very good things about East Asia, but I must again repeat this thing that the foundations of Western philosophy and Western values, which enabled a Western culture, has been copied by East Asia, but they have not yet been able to copy the Western values and Western philosophy. So I don't know what will happen once the West has ceased to exist, and the West will cease to exist the way it is, because Western people have far too many of non-Europeans living in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and increasingly in Europe. So unfortunately, the West will cease to exist the way it is as a Western civilization. East Asia remains the only hope, and there's no guarantee that East Asia will do well in the future, but that's the only hope in my view.
I have two questions from the members. One of them is by which metrics do you measure improvement? And the second is, how do you see Israel in that bigger picture?
Well, so how do I measure improvement? The biggest thing that I have seen in China, for example, over my several trips every year for the last 15 years, say, except of course for the last 2 years, has been that people have become increasingly sophisticated and cultured. When I started going to China, let's say people weren't necessarily lining up, queuing up for getting into public transportation, etc., etc. And those things have changed quite a bit. Far fewer people spit on the road, far more people line up, queue up. Far more people are less noisy when they are in public space. So I see that sophistication coming in that society. They care about their environment. I was recently in Paris, and I needed Wi-Fi connection data from someone, and it was actually a Chinese girl who came forward to help me out with data connection. When I travel, I see Chinese helping out other people. I see Chinese standing up against tyranny. When they see something wrong happening, I see more and more Chinese standing up for what they consider to be wrong. And that tells me that Chinese society is on a path forward. Now, here is the problem with China today. Xi Jinping is becoming a tyrant. And Xi Jinping wants to institute himself as a lifelong leader. Things can go wrong in China, unfortunately, because of Xi Jinping. But overall, I see massive improvements happening in China. It's not just economic improvement. Now, I also see massive amount of economic improvement happening in China. There are tens and tens of cities in China that look extremely modern. They look like Manhattan. And there are very energetic people running around in those countries. You look at your laptop, your cell phones, most of them are made in China. So you see that there's also economic progress. But my key is cultural progress. And the cultural progress is the backbone. Without cultural progress, nothing else is sustainable. And that is why I say that the third world countries, because they are culturally getting degraded, because of the removal of European administration, there's no hope from the third world. But China, of course, is not a third world country. China is a second world country, and the only second world country with a hope to become a first world country. Countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam, they are all small countries, have a hope to become second world countries. And they are improving, but I think they will face a glass ceiling at some point of time and might stop improving. But China is the only hope among all the backward countries.
Yeah, just a reminder about Israel, if there is something you would like to add about that country.
Yeah, well, I have never been to Israel, and I recently read Exodus for the book Exodus, and I was, Israel is something that. Okay, let's go back a bit. Indians are not taught about Jews and Israel as students. So I went to the UK not knowing anything about Jews and Israel. And the reason is that one of the most important, the so-called freedom fighter of India was in bed with Hitler. And government of India does not want people to know about the Holocaust that was happening in Germany. So they don't want to talk about that to avoid that reflecting badly on this so-called freedom fighter of India, whose name is Subhash Chandra Bose. So it was only when I came to the UK 30 years back that I started learning about Israel and Jews and what was happening. I mean, Israel is probably the only country which is westernized from my understanding in the Arab world. But then again, what I have seen during this last 2 years of COVID control in Israel, I think it is entirely possible, if I have understood it right, that Israelis have lost their capability to fight against tyranny. They have become too comfortable in the wealth that they have grown up, and they have not resisted enough government's imposition of tyranny during the COVID times.
Absolutely, we are in agreement. And for as long as it's not a tyranny, if you ever wish to come to Israel, I will be more than honored to host you and for you to be my guest. One last question, if I may. Can you tell us about your conference, the annual conference of capitalism and morality in Vancouver?
Okay, so I was in India for the last 2 months, and I flew to San Francisco a few hours back because I'm on my way to Vancouver tomorrow evening, sorry. And the reason is that I have been running a conference called Capitalism and Morality for the last 12 years in Vancouver, and it is called Capitalism and Morality. The next one will happen on the 20th of August. It's a one-day seminar. A lot of good people come and speak at the seminar. For example, Jeff Deist of Mises Institute, Walter Block of Mises Institute, regularly come. Doug Casey, Rick Rule, Adrian Day, they regularly come and speak at that seminar.
That's incredible. Allow me to see if there are any questions from the members. If anyone wants to ask a question, kindly raise your hand. Yes, Dr. Santosh. Go ahead, Santosh. Hello? I unmuted you. You can
Oh,
speak.
sorry. So I have a question to Jayant. You just made a statement that Indian government, from the start, they try to keep the Jews Holocaust under the wrap or in hiding because of the Subhash Chandra Bose. Do you have any evidence of that?
If you look at the school books in India, there's not much discussion about the Holocaust. Now let me, for my Jewish friends, listeners, that does not mean that there is anything against Jews in that, because India is probably a very pro-Israel country, for the wrong reason probably, I think, but it is a pro-Israel country, and India historically has had nothing against Jews. But to protect the image of Subhash Chandra Bose, they do not talk much about Jews in school books, and most Indians are clueless about Jews and Holocaust when they grow up as adults.
I think I still did not get the primary evidence from you. I have an objection to your assertion. And second point is, what do you say about the reason could have been? Because India has first educational minister being a Muslim. I would like to know, was that the reason? Because there's a Jew and Muslim issues. So who is going to teach the Indian masses? It is the education ministry who charts the courses. So if you have a Muslim, there were 4 consecutive Muslim educational ministers. Why would you put it into other politicians' name that they were the reason behind keeping the Jews Holocaust away, while the problem is our first education minister was from Saudi Arabia, had no formal education at all, but was given the education ministry. So I think we need to kind of confirm some of the facts, and instead of saying with the confidence that this is the reason the government did it, you should be providing some of the evidence is there.
So, Ms. Dogra, do you agree that whether it was because of Muslim educational minister or other reason, do you agree that the story of the Holocaust is not properly taught to students in India?
Well, for that reason, Indians were not even taught about their Hindu history.
Yeah, but Dr. Dogra, let's stick with one subject. Let's talk about, because we are talking about the Holocaust right now.
If you allow me the conversation, it can't be that you just stop me halfway away. My question is, or my statement is, Hindu history is not included in the courses. There is a big fight going on, including our mandir, our temples are under government control, which were from British time and more are now. So Hindus are even devoid of their own history. Forget about any other history. The only glorification in the books had been about the Mughals, the Muslim era. And it seems if we go by the educational courses, Indian history actually begins from the Mughals, which is obnoxious, and there's a huge fight going on and on to correct the course.
Dr. Dogra, I will respond to this specific part to do with history because I have some very strong views on it. But can we just complete that one topic about the education related with Holocaust taught to Indians? Do you agree with me? I'm asking you this just a specific question. Do you agree with me that this what happened in the Second World War, the Hitler's Nazi rule and the Holocaust is not taught properly to Indian students? Yes or no?
Absolutely. There's no
Okay,
disagreement on that.
so thanks for that. So what you said was that it was because of the Muslim ministers of education that it might have been suppressed, and I appreciate you for bringing that color to the conversation. I didn't know about it, so thanks for that. But the fact remains that the story of the Holocaust is not taught to Indians properly, or I would say not taught at all to Indians. Now, let's talk about Hindu history, and I consider that to be a completely separate subject. Indians have no concept of history. Indians are fooling themselves if they think that there was this great Hindu civilization. There is no evidence that there was this great Hindu civilization in the past. It was the English who brought some concept of history to India. It was the English who translated the forgotten and lost books of Indian past. The Indians did not know about the Vedas and the Upanishads. It was the English who brought that in front of its people. Even today, most Indians have no concept of Indian history. Indian history that most people today know about come from extraordinarily romanticized version of Indian history played on Indian movie theaters and TV serials, who are completely, virtually all mythical. There's virtually no reality about it. And the funniest thing is that those people wear Muslim clothes. Those ancient Hindu rulers are shown as wearing Muslim clothes in those TV serials. So again, the great Indian history, Hindu history, simply does not exist. It's all made up.
Okay, my question then be, on which premise are you making this wrong assertion to the audiences who are completely oblivious of what Hinduism is, what our practices is? And I am one of the person who is going through the Kundalini awakening experience through my divine devas, and who has read our own history through our Shankaracharyas and very many such people. And you here sitting giving wrong information to the audiences who have no knowledge of our background? How could you make such a blatant wrong statement that we had no history? Who was Raja Chola? Who was Pandavas? And many such historical thousands of years of history.
One second. Miss Santosh.
No, let me finish.
Miss Santosh, wait 1 second. Are you interested to engage in a conversation with her about that? Or because this is not the reason why I invited you, but if you are interested and willing, then I can let it go. It's up to you.
If she does, I would encourage her to just lower her voice slightly. She sounds like she's getting a bit heated there.
Well, yeah, so let me just respond to what she was saying, and I'm happy to respond to her. I don't claim to know everything in life. Indians are among the most impervious people in the world in accepting the bad aspects of their societies. For example, India is probably the only country that I've been to about 100 countries, and India is probably the only country in the world that does not have sidewalks. Anyone who has been to India pretty much knows that it's virtually a different planet. I was in India 2 days back, and India already feels like as if whatever I know about India couldn't be true, because it's so completely chaotic. It's dirty. You go to Bombay. I was in Bombay for a day. It's dirty. There's, your only hope is that you would come across fresh poop in Mumbai, because rotting old poop is very bad. Has a much worse smell. Half of Indians go to poop in the open. Now remember, when Romans 2000 years back had sanitary system and lead piping, Indians after 2000 years still haven't managed it for most of their population. In fact, Indian toilets are so dirty that actually I go out in the open if I have to use a public toilet. So that is the status of Indian so-called civilization. India has no civilization. It's a feral country with no moral backbone. And now you're talking, Dr. Dogra, you're talking about Kundalini and yoga. A lot of that is a product of how the British structured the scriptures after they found it. Indians had forgotten most of it. And I might add that a lot of these yoga practices and a lot of these so-called Kundalini things are destroying the West by teaching them about these mystical practices of India. And these are mystical practices, remove them from their Christian background, which are behind the progress and civilization of the West.
My good sir, I muted her, and I don't know if I should let her speak because she seems aggressive to me, and I don't know if you want to engage in a debate with her.
I'm happy to listen back to her once more if she wants me to respond to her. But
okay,
listen, but just for a second, did you
Yes.
you and the audience notice that we were talking about Holocaust and she wanted to change the subject to Hindu history? Did you notice that? And that is a
I did.
typical Indian irrational behavior. The Indian don't discuss to understand things or reveal facts. They discuss to earn brownie points. I'm not here to earn brownie points, but I'm more than happy to learn anything new that she has to say to me.
Yeah. Dr. Santosh, I'm going to unmute you, but please be polite and kind. I don't want it to turn into something that we are going to regret. You have to remember he is the speaker here, and this is his speech. So go ahead.
I think this man suffers from low self-esteem because he has
No. That's not an argument. Please, if you have something to listen, I will mute you, and it's not going to end nicely. So if you have something smart to say and you can make a proper argument, so he can respond to that, then go ahead. But do not use any kind of personal attacks, or don't say anything specifically about him and his personality or whatever. Say the argument that you have, please.
I think you both have advantage of denigrating us, and you want to put a stop on other people. I think this is a very abusive platform. I'm going to report it and report the speaker. I have heard enough BS from this man. He continues
thank you. Thank you.
So just to respond to her comment about low self-esteem, it's a very funny thing how low esteem Indians suffer from. I ran Indian office of an English company, and one of the worst things possible was to have a European visiting me in India. I would go to a boardroom of an Indian public sector company, and the European people would be served tea in ceramic cups, and I would be served tea in plastic cups. Indians look down at their own people, and they are servile towards Europeans, and you see that all the time in India. So now, talking about low self-esteem, what I'm saying, I'm currently sitting in a Western society, and people in the West hate hearing what I have to say because they are so politically correct. So it harms me to be saying what I'm saying professionally. So I don't even know why she should be coming up with these comments about self-esteem, but this is Again, a very common Indian practice. This is, again, this is a very funny thing. I have many times been asked by other people they should let Indians come to my speeches in conferences. And I say, please let them come in because they prove my point.
Yeah, it's interesting that this lady is not living in India. She's so fond of India and that culture that she decided, if I remember properly, to live in the States or maybe in the UK. Just a point that I would like to emphasize. Anyway, I'm sorry for that. I had no intention for you to have any kind of,
No, I enjoy this. The funny thing is that tomorrow when I go to Vancouver, there will be a celebration happening in Vancouver on India's Independence Day. And it's such a hypocritical event to happen in Vancouver because these people basically are saying that they got rid of white people from India and then they moved to live in a society ruled by white people. It is so hypocritical. They should at least walk their talk and return back to India. And I will actually respect their views for that because at least they walked their talk.
Yeah. Well, when you're gone and you don't have to deal with her lack of argumentation, just attacks, then she will be able to speak her mind if people care to hear that. I would like to thank you very much for your time, for your knowledge, for all that you're doing for the freedom movement with your conference in Vancouver and the amazing information that you're putting out there. This was a great honor for me. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
I will send you the copy of the video immediately. Is there anything that you want to add before we say goodbye?
Well, I mean, if any one of you is in Vancouver, I'd love to have them at my seminar. But all the videos of my seminar also go on YouTube and on my website.
Yes, I will put the links out again in the groups, and I will forward the lecture to many other groups so more people can be informed about the subject. So thank you again, and I will see you soon.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.